Hello students, the title of this lecture is Initiatives for Peace and Development. As we all know that the post-Cold War era has witnessed a proliferation of different types of threats to security, which are primarily of a non-military nature. So therefore, peace and development actually is very closely linked to the issue of security. You can very well understand that if there is an economic crisis, if there is social deprivation, if there is high unemployment, high inflation, if an economy is not functioning properly, then obviously it is going to affect society as a whole, and that will lead to social unrest, which is a form of insecurity. So therefore, in order to deal with such a situation, it is necessary to bring development, and development also will hopefully lead to peace. So peace and development are inseparably linked, and the post-Cold War era has witnessed actually a proliferation of initiatives to bring peace and development, so that there is you have a more just, peaceful, and prosperous world through either collective efforts or individual efforts. In fact, let us first concentrate on efforts for peace. Now, this was very widely discussed, in a paper which was prepared by the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Boutros Ghali, in 1992. Now, this was prepared actually. This Agenda for Peace report was prepared by Mr. Ghali as a result of a request from the Security Council in January 1992. Now, of course, the report is a very long one, so it is not possible to go into the details. But basically, what the report emphasized was actually that the UN will strengthen its efforts in peacekeeping, peacemaking, and preventive diplomacy to face post-Cold War issues. So therefore, in fact, it was hoped and it was expected that the United Nations will now be playing a more proactive role than it had done during the Cold War period. Now, in order to implement the agenda for peace, of course, there was the need for sufficient and dependable advance commitment of UN members, particularly in terms of funds and forces. Now, I'm sure you can understand that if you are maintaining a peacekeeping force in a conflict zone in any part of the world, it is necessary to have two things. Firstly, you need to have a sufficient number of forces, soldiers, which will be contributed. The UN doesn't have its own forces, armed forces, so obviously it has to depend on its members. And secondly, there is also the need for sufficient funds. Now, the funds will obviously will have to be provided by the member states, because the UN itself actually does not have any funds apart from, of course, what the member states contribute. Now, the member states actually agreed. Here the member states played actually a dual role. On the one hand, they agreed to increase funds for peacekeeping, but so far as peace enforcement and preventive deployment was concerned, they were more cautious, because they were afraid that their own authority and their own ability will be curtailed as a result of an enhancement of the UN's peace enforcement and deployment activities. You may find that rather strange, but that is the reality, and that is what happened. Now, apart from that, another issue actually that hogged limelight, or that attracted limelight during this period, was of course the issue of weapons of mass destruction. Now, I think I should just mention in a few words what is meant by words of weapons of mass destruction. In other words, simply weapons that are able to kill a huge number of people. That is, these are the weapons which are referred to as weapons of mass destruction. For instance, nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons are weapons of mass destruction, and then apart from that, there are other kinds of incendiary devices, bombs, missiles, which also can be classified as weapons of mass destruction. So obviously, an effort was underway in signing of multilateral treaties or on disarmament and arms control, so that it is possible to reduce and ultimately eliminate the stockpiles of such weapons of mass destruction. Now, the first notable achievement in this regard was, of course, the 1993 Chemical Weapons Convention. Now, chemical weapons actually are considered to be a very, very devastating kind of weapons of mass destruction, because I'm sure you can understand the implications of that. These weapons actually leave people deformed, disabled, and in every possible way, actually, if they are not killed, their lives become utterly miserable. So therefore, this particular convention banned development, production, stockpiling, and use of these weapons. And apart from that, a verification mechanism also was devised to destroy existing stocks. So you can say that this was a major achievement, because already chemical weapons of a huge quantity actually had been acquired by various states, so these had to be destroyed. And whether they were being destroyed or not, of course, the United Nations created a verification mechanism which was to ensure that these weapons were actually destroyed. However, I think it would be wrong to say that chemical weapons have been totally eliminated from the face of the earth. Some states are still secretly harboring chemical weapons. In 1996, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the CTBT Convention. It was basically Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. What it actually dealt with was the banning of any kind of testing of nuclear weapons. Now, already the partial test ban treaty had banned actually the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere and underwater, but nuclear weapons were still being tested underground. Now, this also was thought to be banned by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, as a result of which, any kind of testing of nuclear weapons underground was sought to be banned. However, it did not succeed for the simple reason that it lacked consensus. India particularly very seriously objected against this, and because of reasons which I cannot go into the details of because of lack of time, and India felt that it was discriminatory. In fact, India had not earlier signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty either. The United States also ultimately did not accept it, although the US President Bill Clinton actually signed the convention, but the United States Senate did not ratify it. Now, according to the rules of the American Constitution, any international treaty has to be ratified by the Senate of the United States Congress by a 2/3 majority. However, the American Senate rejected it. So effectively, the CTBT became infructuous. I mean, that means it could not be implemented. Then thirdly, in 1997, a convention on landmines was signed. Now, landmines, you may imagine, you may know, I think, that landmines are kept underground, actually, in a way that, nobody would be able to monitor that there is something below the ground. But when a vehicle passes over it, or when a human being passes over it, actually it explodes and kills either the passengers of that vehicle or the person who's passing over it. So, effectively, these are silent killers. Now, this particular Ottawa Convention of 1997 prohibited use, production and transfer of landmines. Now, again, the landmine treaty also has not been very effective because reservations were expressed by the United States, India and Pakistan about some provisions. So, it cannot be said that the landmines provision is also an unqualified success. Fourthly, in 1998, a statute for setting up an international criminal court for trying crimes against humanity, genocide, and other kinds of serious violations of human rights was set up. Now, this became a reality in 2001, but again, one cannot say that this particular court also, that is the International Criminal Court, also has been an unqualified success, for the simple reason that the United States and India, they are not a party to it. And, as a result of it, the United States actually does not accept its jurisdiction. India also does not accept its jurisdiction. Apart from it, there are actually, it was felt that conventions were also necessary on small arms and terrorism, but they have not been so far very successful. That is, no conventions have been drawn up on small arms and terrorism. I now pass over to efforts to bring peace to conflict-torn countries. Because obviously, unless you have, as I said at the beginning, that unless you have peace, you cannot have development. Now, I would mention a series of agreements actually which were signed to bring peace to conflict-torn regions. For instance, in 1993, a peace agreement was signed between Israel and Palestine, which was sponsored by the United States, but unfortunately that was not implemented due to various reasons, and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians still continues. Then in 1995, the Dayton Accord was signed to bring an end to the conflict in Bosnia. Now, the European Union was not able to end this conflict, so the United States intervened, and President Bill Clinton took a personal initiative to bring this conflict to an end, and so the agreement was signed at Dayton in Ohio in the United States in 1995, which brought this conflict to an end. So this was, you can say, a major achievement. Then you are all familiar with the history of the civil war in Sri Lanka from 1983 onwards, the Tamil on the Tamil issue, and the Norwegians, that is Norway, actually made very serious efforts to mediate between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamils and the Tamil Tigers, particularly the Tamil Tigers. But that also did not succeed, and ultimately what happened was that in 2009 the Sri Lankan army launched a massive operation and defeated and eliminated the LTT, that is the Tamil Tigers. So that is how the Sri Lankan civil war ended, but of course in a victory for the Sri Lankan government. Apart from it, in the United Nations also sponsored, agreements in collaboration with regional organizations. And again, I will not have the time to go into the details, but I can mention some of the agreements that I am referring to, namely the Paris Agreement on Cambodia in 1991, which brought an end to the conflict in Cambodia, the Bonn Agreement on Afghanistan. That was not very successful because the Afghan conflict is still unresolved. But there was some kind of an agreement in on Afghanistan, but again, this was not. Now, the United Nations peacekeeping operations actually have multiplied during this period. I mean, I have already referred to the UN peacekeeping operations. And these operations actually have been a qualified success. I think that is all I can say. That means that in some cases they have been successful, in some cases they have not been so successful. And in many cases, because of the nature of the conflict and because of the fact that the states concerned actually were unable to exercise their own authority over the territory. So, because of the ethnic strife, or because of the nature of the civil war, and so on and so forth, so the United Nations, in many cases, actually had to perform roles which otherwise would have been performed by the states themselves. For instance, separating the fighting factions, disarming military and rebel forces, delivery of humanitarian supplies, protection of civilians under threat, repatriation of refugees, conduct of elections, providing interim administration, etc., etc. I mean, in other words, frankly speaking, when the United Nations was established in 1945, it was not envisaged that it will be required to perform such jobs. But that is precisely what the United Nations has had to do. I now pass on to the second part of my lecture here, that is activities relating to development. So far I just discussed peace efforts, what efforts were made actually to try and bring peace. Now, before I pass on to the issue of development, I should remind you that one cannot say that all these efforts to bring peace actually have been a total success. In many cases, there have been successes, but in many other cases, actually, they have failed. There are plenty of instances of that. Now, so far as development is concerned, now, of course, development is the basic objective of any underdeveloped, poor, backward country. I think you all know that the world is divided between the rich and the poor. There are rich countries which are located primarily in Europe and North America. As opposed to that, there are actually poor countries which are located mostly in Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America, not all over Latin America. So obviously these poorer countries, they were under colonial control earlier. So they wanted to develop their economies and their societies. And as I told you earlier, that this kind of efforts to develop require resources. And what happened was that in the post-Cold War era, there has been a tremendous competition for resources, from the former socialist countries. In fact, these were countries which were previously under Soviet control. They were part of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War period. Now they made a transition from socialist economies to free market economies in the post-91 period, and so therefore they also needed resources for development. So they were also in competition. And at the same time, in fact, the United Nations has been constrained in terms of its ability to supply the kind of resources that are necessary. So therefore, in fact, the two agencies, that is the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, these are the two primary agencies, which are in a position to supply funds. But they also will only give money under all kinds of strict conditionalities. And in many cases, it is difficult for the poorer countries to meet these conditionalities. And then, of course, another source, of course, is aid from the developed countries, the rich industrialized countries. Now, the rich countries also, during this particular period, that is the 25 years, have been hit by recession, inflation, unemployment, and so on and so forth. So their ability to also contribute has been considerably limited. Now, the United Nations, of course, has made considerable efforts to try and mitigate various kinds of inequalities and other problems, some of which you are already aware of, like climate change and human rights issues and so on and so forth. So the United Nations actually has convened several important conferences to promote awareness and facilitate consensus on the kind of action which is desirable to address different facets of development. Now here I can give examples of some specific conferences. The first that should be mentioned, of course, was the Rio Conference, the Rio Summit on Environment in 1992. In fact, this can be regarded as a milestone in trying to arrest environmental degradation. Now, environmental issue actually has been a serious issue, as we all know, and climate change has been a serious issue, as we all know. So we can say that this was a particular conference which was aimed at arresting the problem of climate change. It was, of course, subsequently followed by the Kyoto Conference of 1997, which resulted in a series of protocols which tried to cap carbon dioxide emissions, which contribute to global warming and climate change. Then there was the Vienna Summit on Human Rights in 1993. The protection and promotion of human rights has become one of the major objectives of the international community and the international efforts. So the Human Rights Conference of 93 actually was a milestone in this regard. Then there was the Cairo Summit on Population in 1994. Now, I'm sure you are all aware of the fact that that burgeoning population, rising population actually threatens human security. If there are too many people, actually, the Earth's resources are finite. They are limited. So it is not possible for the Earth actually to sustain, an unlimited number of human beings. So it is necessary to control population, the growth in population, and so therefore the awareness has been growing in this regard, and countries are trying to arrest population growth. Two other important conferences took place, one on women in Beijing in 1995. Women's issues, as you are all aware of, have come onto the agenda, onto the international agenda. Equality, fair treatment of women, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the Sustainable Development Conference in Johannesburg. This again deals with the issue of development, but development that can be sustained in the sense that does not degrade or damage environment. That is sustainable development. Then in 2000, actually a very important development took place, and that was that the United Nations General Assembly adopted what came to be known as the Millennium Development Goals, MDG. Basically, what the MDG dealt with was, of course, very basic issues of people who were earning less than $1 a day, how to increase their income, primary education for all male and female children, arrest and reversal of HIV, AIDS, and other major epidemics, improvement of at least 100 million slum dwellers, and so on and so forth. Now, the question is that we have already crossed 2015. Have these goals been achieved? The answer to that question is that some of these goals have been achieved, but many have not been achieved. So, the United Nations General Assembly in September 2015 again chalked out a milestone that by 2020, in fact, these goals will finally be reached. So we can say that a lot of effort has been given to in fact bring peace and to promote development during the post-Cold War period, because if we have a peaceful, prosperous and just world, then and then only we can achieve security, or the kind of security, human security, that we are primarily concerned with.